Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
This is Jane. She thinks she's just filling her car, but she's also filling the air with cancer-causing toxic chemicals used to boost octane in gas. What doesn't burn in the engine enters the air and your lungs, even your heart and brain. Bad for everyone, especially kids. Ethanol is a natural octane booster, clean burning and non-toxic. More ethanol means less scary stuff in our gas and in the air we breathe. And that makes your choice pretty plain, Jane. American Ethanol, cleaner air for Nebraska.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Bryce Duskin. On this episode, Todd Hultman discusses corn and soybean markets. Leonardo Bastos talks about corn nitrogen stabilizers. Mary Drewnoski explains nitrate toxicity in cattle production. And Tim Aydt shares information on ethyl acetate. DTN's Todd Hultman is our market analyst this week. The U.S. Department of Agriculture's latest crop progress report was issued on Monday. Nationally, corn planting progress has reached 17%, which is behind the 27% five-year average. Soybean progress is in line with the five-year average at 5% planted. Nearby corn futures have reached $4 as production is predicted to be lower than demand under traditional yield and usage conditions. Soybean traders appear to be watching a high-stakes meeting between the U.S. and China regarding trade. We spoke with Todd Wednesday afternoon about these topics, but began by asking him about the crop progress report.
Yeah, Bryce. Well, we've had a slow start to the planting season this year. We had a winter storm come through just a couple weeks ago. So we've had delayed planting for corn. That caught a lot of the attention in the crop progress report. USDA is now saying 17% of U.S. corn has been implanted. And they did note a little progress in Illinois and Missouri. Iowa came in about 17% on the national average there. Soybeans are just getting started. They're 5% planted. That's no surprise, mostly in the south. And of course, they're waiting for corn to get done in the Midwest, which may be a little longer this year than usual. And then finally, we had some wheat numbers. The crop conditions for winter wheat continued to be very poor, only 33% good to excellent rating on the national crop. Roughly half of the Kansas wheat crop rated poor or very poor.
Are traders paying attention to those numbers right now, or at what point do they start getting concerned?
Well, you always have to take those numbers with a grain of salt. It's a very rough observation. It doesn't always translate specifically to what's happening in the time. And actually right now we're looking much more at forecasts when it comes to planting expectations. And the forecasts are looking much better for row crops right now. It looks like we're going to have warmer and drier conditions, and that'll be very helpful in getting those soil temperatures warmer and getting a lot of that field work done.
On those row crops, we've seen some pretty good prices lately. Let's break down a few of those, beginning with corn.
Yeah, it's a big surprise when you go back to last harvest, and it was bigger than everyone expected, and we were coming in around 2.5 billion bushels of ending stocks we were talking about. Well, since that time, our cash corn price on a national average has risen about 70 cents a bushel. We're now at our highest price in 22 months on that national cash average. So it's been nice appreciation. A lot of it got a big boost from the drought in Argentina early this year, and it's just been a very nice seasonal influence that we normally see in this off time of year.
On the soybean side, there's been a lot of outside pressure as talk of tariffs with China have been going on, but those markets are still performing well.
Yes, boy, soybeans are just on the edge of you don't know if it could be trouble or there's actually a bullish scenario for soybeans too. To put this in perspective, let me point out that the soybean markets outside of the U.S. are looking very bullish at this time. The Argentina drought cut their supplies drastically this year, and it put Brazil in a situation of being basically the primary supplier to China, while China is doing all they can to avoid buying U.S. soybeans. So even though Brazil is just coming off of a record harvest right now, their FOB soybean prices are very high compared to where they typically are. So we have a very tight situation for soybean supplies outside of the U.S. In the U.S., it's been a different story. We've struggled to find demand without China being an eager buyer for our markets, and our soybean shipments are down about 13% from a year ago. These trade talks, which start on Thursday, are going to be very important in trying to figure out where this market is headed.
You mentioned that big meeting happening in China. Tell us more about what the conversation will be at that meeting and how traders will be closely following that.
Boy, wouldn't we all like to know that. You know, I think the guesses are wide open right now. It's hard to assume anything from the team that President Trump has assembled for this, because he's got some people such as Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, who seems very hopefully optimistic that we can strike a deal with China and maybe avoid some of these tariffs that we've been talking about. On the other hand, you've got some more hostile China advisors in there, Peter Navarro in particular, who may be very tough for China to make a deal with. So right now, I think it's very difficult to predict how this meeting's going to go.
How high can they go? They're on kind of a continuum here with the corn and the soybean specifically.
Yeah, you know, rather than shooting for a price target, which I don't know, and especially in the case of soybeans where we have this trade issue, which could go either way, it's very tough to call a price. But I will say seasonally, we need to be careful. So the 10-year seasonal high for corn is roughly early June. We're just a month away from that. This could be a prime time, especially with prices as high as they are, to find that seasonal high somewhere shortly here. And on soybeans, early July is typically their seasonal high. So those are more of the targets that I have in mind.
Next week, Frayne Olson, North Dakota State Extension economist, will join us to provide his analysis of the corn and soybean markets. Nitrogen loss in cornfields can result in a loss of time, money, and resources. According to Leonardo Bastos, a UNL graduate research assistant of agronomy, management practices and environmental conditions are two factors for nitrogen loss in corn production. Leonardo says that by selecting a nitrogen fertilizer stabilizer, farmers are able to decrease the impact of unpredictable weather. We recently sat down with Leonardo to learn more about the different nitrogen fertilizer stabilizers.
So nitrogen is a very important nutrient for plant growth and development. It is involved it's a building block of amino acids, which are very important for enzymes and proteins that play many different roles in the plant. And one of the compounds that nitrogen is a part of is chlorophyll, which is a compound that's responsible for photosynthesis in plants. And so if a plant is well supplied with nitrogen, it will be producing chlorophyll at its potential and performing photosynthesis at its potential if no other nutrient is limiting. And so if we see a very well fed plant with nitrogen, it would be a dark green color. And then we can tell that from a nitrogen deficient plant, which would be a lighter green. And that's how you can visually tell that nitrogen is really being deficient in the plant or sufficient.
According to Leonardo's recent Crop Watch article titled Nitrogen Fertilizer Stabilizers in Corn, he says that by adding nitrogen fertilizer to a corn crop, a farmer is able to achieve the high demand of about 1.2 pounds of nitrogen that is needed to produce a bushel of corn. However, due to fertilizer management practices and environmental conditions, there is still a possibility of nitrogen loss.
Nitrogen losses occur mostly when we have an excess of nitrogen in the soil and the demand by the plants are not there quite yet. So usually if we apply nitrogen too early in relation to when the plants need it, nitrogen will be in the soil for a longer time, and that coupled with specific weather patterns can drive nitrogen losses.
To help decrease the chances of nitrogen loss, Leonardo recommends farmers use one of three types of nitrogen fertilizer stabilizers, such as nitrification inhibitors, urease inhibitors, and slow-release coated fertilizers.
So when a farmer is deciding whether or not to use a nitrogen fertilizer stabilizer and also what type, the things that he or she should consider is their overall management, and specifically when it comes to their nitrogen management. So when are they applying nitrogen, what source they're using, what rate they're using. So things that really impact the overall management for their crop. and also what weather patterns they may expect from given all those other management choices that they have. So for example, a farmer that is applying anhydrous ammonia in the fall may be at a higher risk of losing nitrogen than a farmer that applies at planting or even side dress. And so those things are very important to keep in mind. And we know that, coupled with all of those management decisions, there's also weather, and weather is one of the things that we cannot control. And so we could think of using a stabilizer as a way of protecting your nitrogen. However, you don't really know that if you are going to need that or not. And so, for a nitrification inhibitor, if you expect that your soil may be a high risk of loss to denitrification or nitrate leaching, using a nitrification inhibitor could help you reduce those losses. And if those losses actually do occur during the growing season, and they are severe enough to limit nitrogen supply to the crop, you will likely have a positive impact on grain yield. When we talk about urease inhibitors, it's mostly, you will likely see a response to that inhibitor if you're applying urea-based fertilizer on the soil surface, and especially if you have high residue conditions, high pH soil, and when you're not expecting to have an incorporation event following, and that could be either by mechanical incorporation or through rainfall. So if you're not tilling your soil and you're applying urea-based fertilizer on top of the soil surface, and you don't expect to have rainfall within that 5-day period after application, you could be that could be a very important time to use urease inhibitor. And the coated fertilizers, they can be very beneficial if you are under any type of loss situation, and especially if you're expecting high variability in weather patterns. And so if that type of situation is what you're expecting, then using a coated urea fertilizer could also be very important in protecting it from being readily available in the soil, and that way from protecting it from multiple different types of losses.
You can learn more about nitrogen fertilizer stabilizers by reading Leonardo's CropWatch article at cropwatch.unl.edu. According to University of Nebraska Lincoln NEB Guide, all plants contain some nitrates. Forages grown in stress conditions can contain excessively high amounts of nitrates. Bacteria in the rumen of cattle can convert nitrates into a nitrite and ultimately an ammonia, which can be fatal. Mary Drewnoski, a Nebraska Extension beef systems specialist, notes that cool growing conditions in early spring can increase the likelihood of forages accumulating excessive amounts of nitrates. We spoke with Mary on Monday to learn more about nitrate toxicity in cattle production.
Essentially, when we have cattle or any ruminant that's consuming a high nitrate feedstuff, the nitrate itself actually isn't toxic to them, but there's bacteria in the rumen that take that nitrate and they reduce it to nitrite, and that's what's toxic, because if nitrite accumulates in the rumen and gets absorbed into the bloodstream, it actually binds with hemoglobin, which is circulating in your blood and helps carry oxygen. Well, it binds to that hemoglobin and causes it not to be able to carry oxygen. So essentially, nitrate toxicity is actually a form of hypoxia, or cattle essentially suffocate because they can't carry enough oxygen to their body and to their brain. So what we try to do when we're thinking about nitrate toxicity is how do we manage the intake of nitrate as well as the conversion of that nitrite, that toxic compound, to a less toxic compound like ammonia. And there are actually bacteria in the rumen that can do that for us as well, so we have to build up that population when we have really high nitrates in the feedstuff so that we actually don't get a buildup of nitrite.
According to Mary, 2 symptoms that your cattle may show due to nitrate toxicity are high respiratory rates and exercise intolerance. In order to avoid these symptoms, it is important to understand what causes high nitrates in forages.
The big thing that causes high nitrate is if we have a lot of nitrogen available and then we have growing conditions that are not favorable. So the plant uptakes that nitrogen and it accumulates it as nitrate, but it can't grow rapidly enough to use it up. And so it's kind of storing the nitrogen for when the conditions get right. So if we have dry conditions, most people think about nitrates, they think about drought. So dry conditions, cool conditions, cool growing conditions, like in the early spring or late fall can actually cause accumulation of nitrates. And then the other big one that I think sometimes people don't think about is actually shade. So if we have a series of cloudy days, you'll actually see nitrate levels accumulate in plants because they'll still be taking up that nitrogen, but they won't be able to grow and utilize it as quickly as they're accumulating it.
Weather conditions may impact the increase of nitrates, but there are also a few plant species that contain more nitrates than others.
A lot of people on range may get nitrate toxicity because of weeds and actually cattle selecting those weeds. But I would say for most producers, the biggest caution is actually annual forages. So pearl millet, sorghum sudan, any of the warm seasons, as well as the cool seasons like oats, rye, any of those can actually accumulate nitrates. But one of the most interesting things with the increase in popularity of cover crops has been brassicas. So turnips and radishes, rapeseed, those also accumulate nitrates. They're great nitrogen scavengers, which means they do a really good job of accumulating nitrates. And indeed, we just worked with Ward Labs to look at samples that producers had sent in of those species. And when we looked at all the fresh samples that were submitted, 40% of the brassicas actually were extremely high in nitrates, such that we would caution about the utilization of them for forage, and about 20% of those grass species. So there is some risk with using annual forages, but we have some ways we can mitigate that risk.
In order to mitigate the risk of using annual forages, Mary refers to the saying, dilution is the solution for pollution. Just like diluting annual forage hay, there are ways to dilute grazing forages.
One of the ways is actually to allow those cattle to be selective. And what I mean by that is lighter grazing pressure will actually allow those animals to eat the higher part of the plant, which is actually lower in nitrates than the lower part of the plant. And they can actually start working their way down and do some self-adaptation, meaning, remember I told you about those bacteria that can actually take the nitrite to ammonia? Well, they have to have nitrite available to grow and multiply and build up. So if we can slowly increase the amount of nitrate levels those animals are eating, they can actually self-adapt. So the other thing is we often tell people that feeding corn, for instance, can help with nitrate toxicity. And that's because the more energy that's available in the rumen, the more those bugs that take the nitrite to ammonia can actually do that, because they actually do that so they can grow and multiply. They're using the ammonia as their protein source, so to speak. So one of the nice things is that with these annual forages, if they are immature, they are actually higher quality and they have more energy available. So some of the challenges are actually avoided because they're high energy. And brassicas are one of those. They tend to be very, very digestible, very high energy. And so we've actually been doing some testing with producers out in their fields because we've seen some extremely high levels, and yet we haven't seen a lot of incidences of toxicity. And so we're trying to figure out what should our guidelines be when we're grazing. I would say they're probably higher than our current recommendations, which are based off of hay feeding, but we don't know how high we can go.
To learn more about nitrate toxicity, you can go to beef.unl.edu. By now, most people have heard of blockchain technology in some form or another, most likely relating to Bitcoin. However, this technology is not limited to cryptocurrency. Agriculture has already seen the technology put to work in commodity trading and precision ag data management. Working with an ag tech startup in Waverly, a Nebraska pork producer has developed a tool that uses blockchain to help livestock producers keep records in a simplified and secure way. The idea for the technology, ChoreCheck, came to Lucas Fricke after hearing fellow pork producers talk about the challenges related to record keeping. You can learn more about ChoreCheck and how it works in the Maine, Nebraska Farmer. In 1985, Nebraska had just one ethanol plant. Today, 25 ethanol plants help make Nebraska the second largest ethanol producing state in the nation. New technology developed by Greenyug can convert ethanol into a higher value chemical known as ethyl acetate. Ethyl acetate can be used in products such as paints and coatings. Last fall, it was announced that Prairie Catalytic, a subsidiary of Greenyug, would be built in Columbus, Nebraska near the Archer Daniel Midland ethanol production facility. Prairie Catalytic will be Greenyug's first commercial production facility, producing ethyl acetate. We recently talked with Tim Aydt, General Manager of Prairie Catalytic, to learn more about this company.
So the parent company is Greenyug. They're a research company that was formed a little over 10 years ago out at Santa Barbara, California. They are a research company that started researching the technology to catalysis convert ethanol into a bunch of value-added chemicals such as ethyl acetate.
According to USDA Rural Development, Prairie Catalytic is planned to produce about 50,000 metric tons of ethyl acetate per year. Ethyl acetate is an ester of ethanol and acetic acid that contains a global market worth $4 billion. This colorless liquid is used in products such as food, packaging, industrial solvents, adhesives, pharmaceuticals, printing ink, cosmetics, paint, and coatings.
It is a commodity in the chemicals market, and 50% of the industry is the paints and coatings industry. It's a non-toxic solvent used a lot in the paints and coatings. But you also see it in fingernail polishes, and you see it in some of the adhesives and some of the industry like that.
Being placed in Columbus, Nebraska, near the Archer Daniel Midland's ethanol production facility, Prairie Catalytic has the opportunity to produce ethyl acetate by using feedstock that comes from Archer Daniel Midland's wet corn mill.
You take ethanol and you use catalysis, which is a reaction process, and you actually crack that ethanol. You generate hydrogen, is one of the byproducts, and then ethyl acetate. The key to the technology is the conversion rates. If we can exceed 85% conversion rates, 85% of the ethanol to ethyl acetate, then that's the commercially viable target that we were shooting for.
We further discussed with Tim about how ethanol is becoming the new naphtha.
Naphtha is a precursor to gasoline in the petroleum industry. It was actually used as a fuel back in the 40s, but during the development of petroleum industry, naphtha became the precursor to many of the chemicals that you know today, such as plastics and some of the solvents and paints and things of that nature. So the idea behind our technology is to use ethanol as the renewable fuels naphtha, essentially.
When compared to naphtha, it is clear that ethanol is the better candidate when creating specialty chemicals.
Naphtha versus ethanol as the precursor to many chemicals. So ethyl acetate is just one of the different chemicals that coming out of the petroleum industry's precursors. Ethanol is an excellent precursor because it's a single chemical. Naphtha is actually a blend. It's the a lighter blend version of crude, so it's one of the lighter blend cuts in the crude industry. Ethanol, on the other hand, is a very clean precursor. So with that, you don't end up with a bunch of byproducts on your offstream, and it saves you a ton of money because you don't have to use so many processes to clean up your final product.
Now with this week's weather forecast, here's Nebraska Extension ag climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we again for the weekly forecast, and during this past week, of course, we dealt with severe weather that started through the Tuesday time frame, and then the storm system finally moved through the Central Plains and to the east of us as we got into the late Thursday evening into Friday morning. So we've seen some significant moisture in parts of the state. The heaviest totals combined for all 3 days of precipitation was south of Interstate 80, particularly portions of southeastern Nebraska. Then we had a couple other primary areas from Broken Bow up toward the Sioux City area, and then along the area from just to the northeast of Grand Island up toward the Fremont area along the Platte River, where we've seen some training of thunderstorms. On Tuesday, we've seen 5 tornadoes that have been confirmed. We just waiting for a complete verification from NWS that appeared through the Storm Prediction Center's website, and 50 hail reports. Now those will probably go up as a few more additional reports go in, particularly on the hail side. But overall, that was the worst of the severe weather, and that represented our first severe weather outbreak of the year. So as we go through this next 7 days, there's a couple more opportunities for thunderstorms, particularly as we get into the early part of next week. So let's get right away to it and go to the upper air models and see what we have in store. And as you look at today, we have this ridge to our west building in. We have the trough to our east. So that's what's the remnants of the inclement weather that moved through our region during the middle part of the week. So we've had high pressure firmly in control from the southern plains to the northern plains. The low pressure associated with the trough are now over the Great Lakes region. So that's where most of the precipitation is to the north, and then of course down into the mid-Atlantic region. For tomorrow, we see that ridge building into our region, so even warmer temperatures tomorrow. High pressure firmly in control. We do see a couple low pressure systems indicated at the surface in the Great Basin region. Those shouldn't be a player in terms of precipitation. Although there's some scattered moisture, this is really occurring during the overnight hours as a little trough moves through, particularly in the Monday morning. That trough will start to make its way into the region, gives us low pressure at the surface in the western Dakotas, low pressure to our south. That is going to allow some moisture to stream northward, but because it's such a weak wave, we don't see a big feed of moisture, so just scattered showers presented by the models for Monday. On Tuesday, the trough strengthens a little bit as it moves to eastern Nebraska. Surface low to our south in the Texas Panhandle may have enough time to get some moisture up into this system, and we see some convection starting to show up in terms of the forecast for eastern Nebraska, but more widespread as this system starts to move toward the east of Nebraska, particularly on Wednesday. We'll see that low pressure system centered over northern Illinois. Heavy precipitation is likely over this region, perhaps another 1 to 2 inches in some locations on top of what is received from earlier this week. It's probably going to slow down planting for a while. Furthermore, on Thursday, we start to see a zonal type flow pattern breaking out. Usually represents dry conditions, even though we're showing surface lows at the surface in South Dakota and western Kansas. It's just not going to be enough moisture with this system with main energy to our north. That's where all the heaviest precipitation will be. And as we get into Friday, we remain in the zonal flow. So it actually looks like decent weather for planting as we go to the end of the week. Even with these low pressures in place, I think it's going to be well overdone in terms of the precipitation that's going to be shown with this setup, particularly over Nebraska. I think once again we'll be facing the heavier precipitation as we get to Iowa and points to the east. So as we go even farther down the road for the 8 to 14 day forecast, we're looking at a widespread above normal temperatures, and in terms of precipitation, the dry continues for the western high plains, so that should help us to get additional planting taken care of.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews are available individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on corn and soybean markets, nitrogen stabilizers, nitrate toxicity in cattle production, and new technology in the ethanol industry. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Next week, Frayne Olson will be our corn and soybean market analyst. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Bryce Duskett. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.